Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute. I'm John Lenchafsky, the president of the Institute, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome a very distinguished speaker who has rendered great service to the United States. Michael Sulick has had a long career with the Central Intelligence Agency, having had an excellent education, first starting out with the study of Russian language and literature, eventually getting himself a PhD at the City University of New York. He served in the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, and in 1980 he joined the CIA and served in a number of different capacities, stationed in many different places around the world, including Latin America, Asia, and in Poland and Russia. He served for a while as the deputy director of the Clandestine Service for a couple of years, 2002 to 2004. He served as director of CIA Counterintelligence. And then from 2007 to 2010, he served as director of the Clandestine Service. We here at IWP, who teach intelligence and counterintelligence, have long tried to ensure that our students have the kind of integrated knowledge of these two disciplines that Dr. Sulick has. And I'm delighted that he has had this kind of experience and that the agency in its wisdom would have hired somebody with his serious counterintelligence credentials to be on the collection side of the house, because at least I may not be completely accurate about this, but it's been long my feeling that our intelligence community has always had a certain preference for collection as against the kind of protection and counterintelligence activities, or even offensive activities that can be done by our counterintelligence services. And so it's a particularly valuable thing when there is this integrated strategic approach brought to the helm of our clandestine intelligence operations. Michael has written a marvelous book, American Spies, where he goes into case studies of a number of those Americans who sought to serve foreign powers. He addresses in here also some interesting cases like that of James Angleton, and who was the former chief of CIA Counterintelligence, whose record and activities have been the subject of great controversy, and when it came to how we conduct our counterintelligence operations. And so I know all of us will be most interested to hear, Michael, your description of your book and your analysis of these vital issues. So we're honored that you're here. Welcome to IWP, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the introduction, John, and for that recounting of my sordid career, such as it was. Last time I came to Washington to give a speech, I was at the Spy Museum. It was 15 degrees. And the time before that, there was an ice storm. So today is the best weather I've had in all these appearances. So I've asked to talk about the one book that's out there, American Spies. I'm actually going to go over two books because I've written a precursor to that. One that covers the first one that covers some of the Revolutionary War up to the Cold War. When I got embarked on this, I myself was even surprised that there were so many spies that the American government had been riddled by throughout history that I had to break it into two books. And in both of these books, I focus on the United States, obviously, since there are some common threads in American espionage history that make the country kind of unique in its approach to espionage and counterespionage. And the most common threat I found was disbelief, actually. Americans refused to believe the unthinkable, if you will, that their fellow citizens would betray the country's secrets, sometimes even when they were confronted with irrefutable proof. And that disbelief kind of ironically stems from two very positive features of the country. One is what I would call our exceptional geography. We were a land blessed with abundant resources and also natural defenses, two huge oceans that isolated us from one side, from the warring nations of Europe, and from the other from the emerging nations of Asia. So in the first 120 years of our existence, we really had no threats from a foreign enemy as such. In a sense, we were at war among ourselves. Tories against revolutionaries in the Revolutionary War, and of course North and South in the Civil War. So we really weren't threatened by a foreign enemy in a major conflict until World War I. So it was natural that Americans didn't really believe there was much of a threat from espionage. One of the earliest examples of that American disbelief is a name that's known to every schoolboy, synonymous with treason and espionage, and that's Benedict Arnold. Now, the colonials knew that the British were actually trying to persuade defections among the officer staff, and they even had some information that a highly placed American general was working for the British. At the same time, George Washington and others knew that Arnold was involved in shady business deals. He had complained pretty loudly about his treatment by the Congress, about money that was owed to him by the Continental Congress, and their refusal to kind of recognize his exploits. Still, Washington and others were shocked when they found out that Arnold was a traitor. You fast forward a century and a half later to the 1930s and 1940s, when the Soviets ran the largest network of spies in both their history and ours. I mean, over 500 Americans who worked throughout the FDR administration and in the Manhattan Project, which at that time was supposedly America's most closely guarded military secret. Then a few defectors from the cause, two couriers, one named Elizabeth Bentley and another named Whittaker Chambers, came forth and provided names to the FBI, and in some senses their stories corroborated each other's. Irrefutable proof is later developed in the government by something which a lot of you probably already know about, the Venona Project. The project started after Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. At that time, the U.S. Army began intercepting messages that were transmitted over landlines from Soviet facilities in the United States back to Moscow. The messages were enciphered, and it was only later in the war, when the United States was afraid that Stalin might make a separate peace with Hitler, that cryptographers began this very difficult task of deciphering these messages. And they found out, much to their dismay, that Soviet intelligence already had spies inside the Manhattan Project. And as they decrypted more messages, they found out that, in fact, the names that Bentley and Chambers had given them early on were indeed spies. Even then, even at that point, the highest levels of the United States government still refused to believe it or do anything about it. Now, after World War II, that situation changes. The United States isn't isolated any longer. It's now a superpower. The Soviet Union is no longer an ally, but an adversary. Revelations about Soviet espionage in the 30s and 40s have kind of awakened the country to the threat. The FBI gets more funds and manpower to intensify their scrutiny of the Soviets. And for the first time in 170 years, the country establishes a National Intelligence Service with the CIA, one of whose main jobs is the recruitment of foreign intelligence officers. Now, despite this, Soviets still successfully conduct espionage. Americans still trusted their fellow citizens and were surprised when those responsible for keeping secrets betrayed them. This often led to very lax security and people overlooking key indicators of espionage. And particular victims from the 1950s up to the 1980s, where it was the Department of Defense, military, and defense contractors. But they weren't the only ones. I mean, that disbelief even extended to institutions whose main jobs involved espionage. In 1994, many of us at the CIA, myself included, an agency whose main job is espionage, were shocked when we found out that one of our own, fellow officer named Rick Ames, was arrested, and it was revealed that he had betrayed the identities of almost every major source that the CIA had in the Soviet government. 7 years later, another organization, one of whose main jobs is counterespionage, the FBI, experienced the same disbelief, a one of its own. Robert Hanssen was arrested for passing the Bureau's pretty much their entire defensive counterespionage playbook and other critical national security information to the Russians. Both of the agencies were severely criticized in post-mortem reviews precisely because of this belief, for this failure to recognize that one of their own could be a spy. Now the second reason for that, this disbelief that I write about, is actually, again, ironically, one of our most cherished values, our advocacy for civil liberties. The Americans have generally been pretty uncomfortable with espionage against others, collecting information on others, and also suspicious about counterespionage, catching of spies. This inherent tension between protecting national security on one hand and guaranteeing civil liberties on the other is at the heart of this entire debate about the NSA programs. But this attitude dates back to the earliest settlers, many who came from Europe precisely to escape oppression and intrigue in the royal courts of Europe. And espionage was clearly a key aspect of those policies. So espionage, collecting information, and catching spies represented aspects of life that they wanted to escape by coming to the New World. So as American history progresses, unfortunately, their suspicions are justified. Because aside from the disbelievers, if you will, who refused to see spies anywhere, there were always minorities of zealots who saw spies and saboteurs everywhere and violated civil liberties in the names of catching these spies. The first instance of this took place in the Civil War when a gentleman named Lafayette Baker ran a counter-spy service for the Union, detained alleged spies and subversives unlawfully. In the process of this, he never caught a real spy. Right after World War I, the same happened again. Attorney General was a gentleman named Mitchell Palmer, had his eye on the White House. And there were anarchists and communists that were around and that were involved in agitation. So Palmer, again, unlawfully detained thousands of people as so-called anarchists and spies and so on, and the so-called Palmer's Red Raids. When his dire warnings turned out to be overblown, and in the end he caught no real spies. Of course, it didn't end there. In the 1950s, Senator McCarthy ranted about communists in the government, especially communist spies. He's eventually censured by the Senate, and again, he turned up no real spies as a result. Fast forward 20 years later, J. Edgar Hoover establishes a program called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, when the FBI was looking for foreign spies or a foreign hand in the civil rights movement and the peace movements. In the end, finds no evidence of any major foreign spies in Martin Luther King's entourage or in the peace movement. Now, suspicions about abuse of civil liberties also contributed to the absence of any institutions or development of any expertise to combat espionage. Americans set up institutions in the Revolutionary War, Civil War. As soon as the wars were over, they were disbanded and people with experience went off to other pursuits. Man who was known as, I guess, recognized today as the father of American counterintelligence, even though his operation only included New York State, was John Jay. As soon as the war was over, he went off to probably a more prestigious job as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But again, he was involved in counterintelligence first and left it. In World War I and its aftermath, institutions to catch spies existed, but unfortunately they fought turf battles over authority. At that time, basically, it was Treasury's Secret Service and Department of Justice Bureau of Investigation, which of course would later evolve into the FBI. Finally, on the eve of World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt invests authority in the FBI, and for the first time in 160 years, the country has a central counterespionage organization. Now, at the same time, these turf battles continued. Distrust between fellow agencies, unwillingness to share information. These rivalries accomplished exactly the opposite of what they're supposed to, failure to catch spies. One landmark case involves a CIA officer, a gentleman named Edward Lee Howard. He was an officer assigned to Moscow. Right before he was due to go, he was given another polygraph. He failed it. He was fired. Edward Howard was a man who lived and breathed revenge, and so he took his revenge on the CIA. Since he was bound for Moscow, he was aware of some of the sources, some of the most sensitive sources the CIA had there. And in September of 1984, he betrayed one of the most productive assets of the Cold War. A gentleman named Adolf Tolkachev, who was an electronics engineer at a highly classified military facility. And the Department of Defense estimated that this one man's information alone had saved DOD something like $50 billion in savings in developing countermeasures against Soviet weapons. Now the CIA hadn't discussed this compromise with the FBI until a Soviet defector came forth and told the CIA that an officer, he didn't know his name, but an officer who had been assigned to Moscow had provided information to the KGB. CIA recognized this was Natalia Howard. They quickly told the FBI, which opened an investigation. Unfortunately, Howard eluded surveillance by the FBI and escaped to Moscow. Lots of recriminations on both sides as a result. Soon after this, CIA sources in the Soviet Union, other ones begin disappearing, they're arrested or executed, and Howard had no knowledge of these, which meant there was another problem. CIA did an internal review which attributed this to any number of possible causes. Maybe the agents were overzealous and stealing documents or spending too much money and drawing attention, or maybe CIA officers in Moscow had made mistakes and led surveillance to find these agents. Finally, a senior counterintelligence officer known to some of my colleagues here, my former colleagues, Paul Redmond, launched an investigation of a possible mole and this time cooperated closely with the FBI. So together they finally catch Rick Ames, CIA officer, who was probably at that time certainly the most damaging spy the agency had ever experienced, because he knew almost every key Soviet source in the Soviet Union. For those who might be interested more on that case, two of my colleagues who worked closely with the FBI, Sandy Grimes and Jean Vertefeuille, have written a book about their experience in this called The Circle of Treason. The case resulted in a number of changes that were imposed by the executive and the legislative branches. Basically, the White House and Congress said, yeah, you boys in the FBI and CIA are going to play nicely in the sandbox whether you like it or not. So passed some legislation and issued executive orders that mandated cooperation between the two agencies. And I would say, at least my opinion, I don't know how others might feel, but I think it actually has worked. And in fact, spies like Hansen and others probably would still be, would have been operated for a lot more time if it hadn't been for this cooperation. It was foisted on the two agencies, but I think after a while both realized that it was the way to go. In the spy cases I treat in both these books, I actually kind of go through 6 elements of espionage: motives, access, tradecraft, the art of clandestinity, how spies communicate, exposure, clearly how they were caught, punishment, and the damage that they did. Motive is pretty much, the American spy for the same motives that people all around the globe would spy for history: money, ideology, thrills, ego, resentment, dual loyalties. In most cases, it's often a combination of them, never usually one clear-cut motive. I mean, even if you go back to Benedict Arnold, he clearly needed money. He was a very venal man. He offered his services to the British for money, but he had other motives. As I said before, resentment against his superiors, felt he had been passed over for promotion, felt he wasn't recognized for his exploits. So in a sense, his motives were greed, but also mixed in with resentment and a thirst for vengeance. Money for him, as it had been for a lot of other spies in American history, was a recognition of his self-worth, recognition that he felt had been denied to him by his own people. And that's kind of typical in a lot of espionage cases. But not all Americans spied for money. In the Civil War, the vast majority of spies on both sides did so for ideological reasons, because of loyalty to the Union or the Confederacy. And frankly, neither side had the money to pay spies anyway. In this unique period in American history I mentioned before, in the 30s and 40s, it was the era of the Depression, seeing that capitalism wasn't working. Soviet propaganda was all over the United States about their economic successes. And Stalin is seen as a bulwark against the rising tide of fascism in Europe. So communism becomes an attractive alternative. And hundreds of sympathizers flock to work in FDR's New Deal, work in the government. A lot of these people started in Marxist discussion groups that were basically exploited by Soviet intelligence and developed into spy networks. And these people were so committed to the cause that rather than receiving money for their spying, they actually paid dues to the Communist Party for the privilege of spying. Now this changes after World War II. America's flirtation with communism is over. American Communist Party is pretty much weakened as a breeding ground for spies. In fact, it was so riddled by FBI informants that agents at the time used to joke that the party wouldn't exist without the dues that the FBI paid to its snitches. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. The majority of spies in the Cold War, again, not all, but majority, vast majority, were motivated by money. Never again would the Russians be able to exploit communist ideology on the scale that they did in the 30s and 40s. Even in the 60s and 70s, kind of a time of high disillusion with the government over Vietnam and Watergate and so on, Americans still kind of protested or expressed their protest loudly in the streets and not by skulking around in government safes and pilfering secrets. So there's really no major spy of the Cold War working for the Soviets who's ideologically motivated. Some minor ones, some exceptions. Two gentlemen actually worked for NSA, Vernon Mitchell and William Martin. They were both kind of mathematical geniuses, but eccentric personalities, viewed as kind of strange by their colleagues and ostracized by them. So the two of them defected to the Soviet Union in 1960 and revealed NSA monitoring of our allies. So to some degree, they were precursors of that guy in Russia. I forgot his name. Snowden, that one, yeah. There was another notable exception too, but she worked for the Cubans. A woman named Ana Montes. It was a throwback to the era of the ideological spy. She rose in her career to be the leading DIA analyst on Cuba. Spied for them for 16 years until her arrest in September 2001, just 10 days after the 9/11 bombings. She was probably able to do this so long because she received no money, just expenses. So she left no financial trail, no evidence of unexplained wealth like other spies have, because her primary motive was ideological. She supported Cuba. Access, what secrets do spies know? Before the Cold War, the United States really suffered for some very high-ranking spies. And Benedict Arnold, clearly the highest-ranking one, but there are others too. In the 40s, Harry Dexter White spied for the Soviets, one of the top 3 people in the Treasury Department. Alger Hiss, high-ranking official at the State Department. But there were also little gray men and women, like a lady named Judith Copeland, who was a clerk in the Department of Justice, where she had access to FBI files that she gave away to the KGB. And the Cold War and after, fortunately, we didn't have any examples of people of that kind of rank, either civilian or military, who were spies. But because of the Soviet threat, there was such a huge buildup in the military and in intelligence that many people had access to classified information. And you could have either low or middle grade civilian officials or military who had access to some of the most precious secrets of the country. As I indicated before, a particular target was vulnerable defense contractors. One example of a case with 2 gentlemen named Christopher Boyce and Andrew Dalton Lee. Boyce had an entry-level job as a $140 a week clerk with a top secret clearance at a defense contractor, TRW. Worked at a vault that was a center for a covert communications satellite system. And he used his friend, Lee, to courier NSA cryptographic information to the Soviets. The pair was dubbed the Falcon and the Snowman. Boyce happened to like his hobby was falconry. Lee had nothing to do with Frosty the Snowman. He was a drug dealer, so his snowman came from his problems with cocaine. He used to not only he would carry NSA secrets in one pocket and cocaine in the other, which he would sell down in Mexico, or he would buy in Mexico. Proved to be his downfall when one time, kind of on a cocaine high, he threw a note over the wall of the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. The local police saw him doing that and detained him. And when they found out, because they thought he was a terrorist or a criminal of some kind, and they found out he had American top secret documents in his possession, and he was quickly extradited, and that ended that case. There are others too involved in routine support duties like translation that gave them access. One was a gentleman named Larry Wu Tai Chin. He actually worked in an unclassified area of the CIA, kind of what's the equivalent today of the Open Source Center. But because he had native Chinese, he was asked to translate documents that were provided by CIA sources in China, which he gave to the Chinese for a period of over 30 years. He's kind of, I like to call him the Cal Ripken of American espionage, because most consecutive years giving away secrets. We move on to tradecraft and exposure, because one leads to the other. Like I said, it's tradecraft is kind of the term art in the business, what you do to ensure the safety of your spy, ensure the safety of your communications. All the things you read about in the novels, the ciphers, and the secret writing, and so on. Some of these techniques dated back centuries. The British actually used invisible ink and secret writing and dead drops during the Revolutionary War. In France, they had an agent, a man named Edward Bancroft, who was spying for them. Bancroft was an aide to Benjamin Franklin while Franklin was in Paris trying to drum up covert support for the French, or from the French. And he used every Tuesday night, he would service a dead drop in a tree in a popular Paris park. Same kind of method that the KGB used in the United States throughout the Cold War and the CIA used in Moscow. So if you don't practice this kind of good tradecraft of security, spies get caught. Soviet intelligence had serious problems with the tradecraft of their vast network of spies in the 30s and 40s. As I said, they kind of evolved to these Marxist discussion groups, never really adopted good security, never really lost this kind of coffee clutch attitude towards spying. The KGB was constantly scolding them for their poor security. The Americans said, look, we know better, this is the United States, we know our environment. The members of these groups they all knew each other, typed each other's information, they constantly on the phone with each other. You would say it's a wonder they didn't get caught, but at the time the FBI was kind of busy doing other things like chasing gangsters, like John Dillinger and the like, and they were also doing counterespionage against the Germans and the Japanese, because the Soviets, after all, were our allies. But because of this poor security, when one of the couriers gets disaffected with the Soviets, Elizabeth Bentley, she goes to the FBI and she's able to give the identity of precise identities of 80 Americans who were working for the Soviets, 27 of them inside the United States government. There's no reason that any one person should know the identities of 80 spies, but that's the way it was. Now the Soviets and their bloc allies significantly improved this during the Cold War. At that time, they would often meet outside the United States to escape the scrutiny of the FBI within our borders here. But one of the main reasons that American spies were caught in the Cold War and after was a dramatic change in our counterespionage philosophy. The central axiom in the trade is you catch spies with spies of your own. The United States had largely ignored this throughout its history until the Cold War. But in the Cold War, one of the main tasks of the FBI and the CIA were acquiring spies or sources in the counterintelligence of the KGB and their allies and other hostile services who could tell us which Americans were spying against the country. So a large number of the spies that I discuss in this book in the Cold War period and after were caught because of the FBI and CIA having these sources in foreign intelligence services. Let me move on to the punishment. Once Americans were caught spying, punishment varied depending on a number of factors. Often that reflected the political dynamics of the era when they were caught. Sentences for espionage throughout history ranged from execution to no punishment at all. In the Revolutionary War, when the first kind of major American spy was caught, a man named Benjamin Church, Washington was infuriated. He wanted Church hung from the highest scaffold until somebody told him there was no espionage law, so they had to devise one. In the Civil War, nobody really paid attention to that law. Minor spies on both sides were caught and they were simply released. Again, neither side had the money to feed them, so they just wanted to get rid of them. But in some cases, some were hung just because of the whim of the local commander. So this haphazard approach ends when Congress enacts the Espionage Act of 1917, a good part of which is still operative today. Now, as I said, punishment reflected the political dynamic of the time, and the best illustration of that is probably one of the most controversial sentences in American history, and that's, of course, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. By the time of their trial in 1951, again, America's attraction to communism had ended, Cold War had started, Soviets had tested an atomic bomb based on secrets that Rosenberg stole, Mao Zedong was on the rise in China, and the Korean War is going on. So in the heated, very anti-communist climate of the time, Rosenbergs are electrocuted. Last time Americans have been executed for espionage. Sparked quite a controversy. The left said they were innocent victims of right-wing hysteria, and the right said they were indeed spies and just symbols of a widespread, festering cancer of Russian espionage in the United States. This debate went on for years. Eventually, a number of sources, declassification of Venona information, Soviet defectors, the Rosenberg's own Soviet case officer, and even the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, revealed that Julius Rosenberg was a spy and acknowledged his contribution. But there was still debate over the severity of the sentence, especially about Ethel Rosenberg. She clearly knew her husband was a spy. She was a dedicated communist, but there was little evidence at the trial about her collaboration. Even J. Edgar Hoover, who was about as anti-communist as could be, opposed the death penalty for her because he thought the image of their two orphan sons would probably hinder FBI spy-catching efforts later on. Now, some spies during the Cold War that I'll discuss in a bit did, I would say, equally far more damage than the Rosenbergs, but were never executed for it. They received life sentences, so because plea agreements were reached. But we'll go into that later. One issue in the Rosenberg debate was the damage that they caused to national security. Julius Rosenberg had no access of his own. He had actually recruited his brother-in-law, a man named David Greenglass, to spy. Greenglass was a mechanic who worked on the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. So he was only able to give partial information about atomic bomb development. It was still useful because it corroborated and filled in information from other spies they had in the project, and they did have a number of them. The bomb, of course, was the most precious U.S. military secret at the time. It enabled the Soviets to build their own version of it ahead of schedule. There are some historians who say that Stalin felt emboldened after that successful atomic bomb test, and thus, he went ahead and sanctioned the invasion of North Korea. A conflict that wound up with 4 million casualties, including 35,000 U.S. servicemen. So call that considerable damage. During the Cold War, a U.S. naval warrant officer named John Walker, a spy for the Soviets, gave away U.S. naval codes, information on nuclear submarines. He enabled the Soviets basically to reproduce an encryption machine, and then provided what's called a key list, which enabled the Soviets essentially to read the daily traffic of the entire U.S. fleet. He ran a spy ring composed of family members and a friend for 18 years. The cryptographic information alone that he gave the Soviets could have allowed them to develop measures to prevent U.S. military communications during a conflict, plus counter the effect of nuclear submarines, which then were considered the most invulnerable part of the nation's triad of land, sea, and air-based missiles. On a spy that was equally damaging on the Army side, a gentleman called Clyde Conrad, Army sergeant. He ran a ring of about 11 members for 14 years, for the Hungarians, which at that time, of course, were Soviet surrogates. He had a position in Germany in war planning that gave him access to information about tactical nuclear capabilities, order of battle, location of missile sites, and deployment of armor and aircraft. What Walker gave away about the Navy, Conrad did for the Army. Both cases, if we had gone to war, it would have given the Soviets decisive advantages that could have turned the tide against the United States. Despite this, neither one of them were executed. They received life sentences. In the Walker case, the government followed what has become a typical practice in the Cold War of reaching plea agreements. They wanted him to cooperate so that they could build cases against all the rest of the members of his ring. But this is also done so the government can avoid exposing secrets in trial, and they have an opportunity to debrief the spies and their activities to kind of get lessons learned and improve their defenses to counter future espionage. Now, overall, I would say that espionage alone doesn't change the course of events. The nation got its independence despite Arnold. Union persevered despite Confederate spies. We survived 2 world wars. And the Soviet Union fell into the dustbin of history despite its espionage successes. So there's clearly other political, military, and economic factors that play a role in all these conflicts. That said, espionage still does take its toll. The losses, once they're discovered, require countermeasures that cost millions of dollars that could have been put into roads and hospitals and schools. Spies also give secrets that result in the loss of life. And one example of this, John Walker. Some of the information he gave the Soviets was passed to the North Vietnamese and enabled them to shoot down American pilots over Vietnam who either killed or spent time as POWs in the Hanoi Hilton. Now, I've been dealing with the Cold War. Obviously, I checked my calendar. That ended 20 years ago, so we'll probably get up to the present a little bit here. The nature of espionage in those 20 years, of course, changed, just as the nature of the threats did. Some things remained the same. Despite the end of the Cold War, the Russians still spy against the United States. But the last major spy for the Russians who was arrested was Robert Hanssen. That was in 2001. There have been some others since, but minor in comparison. A new phenomenon that began in the 1980s was and intensified in the last 20 years was increased espionage by other countries, including our allies. One case that was kind of a forerunner of this dates back to the mid-80s, but still remains one of the most controversial cases today, and that's Jonathan Pollard's espionage for Israel. Pollard was a Navy counterterrorist analyst. He spied for only 18 months while John Walker spied for 18 years. But in those 18 months, he gave over 1 million pages of classified documents to the Israelis. His motives were kind of a murky brew, ego. He liked the fantasy life of the spy, but he also believed that the United States wasn't sharing enough intelligence with Israel, so there's aspects of dual allegiance and revenge involved in this. And he also received money. He liked, again, the high life of what he felt was the James Bond kind of spy. He was also in debt, so money was also another motive for his spying. When he was eventually caught, he made a plea bargain with the Department of Justice, but that bargain was not binding on the judge, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison. The judge was given a classified memorandum by then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, which many feel is what spurred the judge on to give the life sentence. But it was clear even without that, Pollard had given away information that would have given the Israelis a considerable edge in any conflict in the Middle East, and might have even prompted them to take some hostile actions in an area where U.S. policy was very delicate, very volatile area. In any case, in the aftermath, the Israelis have pled with the United States government for years for his release, Pollard's release, claimed the sentence was too harsh. One of their arguments is that the issue is that he was spying for an ally, not against the United States. But American espionage law doesn't recognize that nuance. The most recent Israeli offer was just a few years ago. They said they would continue a moratorium on building new West Bank settlements in return for Pollard's release. That was rejected by the Obama administration. Now, since Pollard, there have been spies from all sorts of countries that one wouldn't expect. Philippines, Greece, Ghana. I almost find it insulting that Ghana would spy on us, to tell you the truth. And would get away with it, but they did. The National Counterintelligence Executive, NCIX, estimated, and I guess it was in 2007? Is that when you estimated? So there was about 140. There were about 140. The former NCIX is here, gracing our presence. Was 140 some countries were actively spying against the United States. The one nation has clearly surpassed them all and has actually eclipsed Russia since the turn of the century. Has been China. Since 2000, there have been over 90 cases, over 90 arrests for espionage involving China. Most of them dealing with corporate espionage under the Economic Espionage Act of 1996. China presents unique challenges to U.S. counterespionage. During the Cold War, the Soviets and the Americans, we kind of mirrored each other. You know, our MO was pretty much the same. We scouted out spies and looked for people with vulnerabilities and used dead drops and secret inks and all this kind of thing. The Chinese modus operandi is somewhat different. You know, they play to the strengths of their billion-plus population to deploy this vast number of people as collectors who elicit tidbits of information, which I believe was a former FBI analyst referred to as the grains of sand approach, where each one gets a little grain till the bucket is full. You rarely get the smoking gun you do in typical espionage cases, the bloated bank accounts, the leaving packages under trees in remote parks and so on. Chinese also rely clearly on ethnic Chinese. They've had some success in this and this appeal to help the homeland without hurting your adopted country. But not all the cases have been like that. There are traditional espionage cases as well that had nothing to do with non-ethnic Chinese. As evidence in the arrest about 4 years ago of 2 Department of Defense employees, but neither one of whom was ethnic Chinese. But one of the more interesting examples was a youngster who was arrested, a man named Glenn Shriver. He was a student, liked Chinese culture, Chinese language. He went off to Beijing to study, and he's recruited there in what's known in the trade as a seeding operation. Basically, agreed that he would go back and apply to the CIA or other agencies involved in national security, and he was given $70,000 for this. This is a man who didn't have access to a single secret, but the Chinese are willing to bet $70,000 that's how important they found it. A case like this to get somebody infiltrated into the CIA or other classified agencies of the government. Chinese also adept at one of the most revolutionary developments in intelligence, cyber espionage. When Pollard was caught, he was actually spotted carrying large, almost suitcases full of documents in the building, and one of his fellow employees thought that a little suspicious, and the case kind of unraveled after that. Clearly the storage, the transmission of secret information is the riskiest part of espionage. But now, thanks to computer technology, spies can transmit larger quantities, faster speeds, using smaller devices like flash drives. Remote cyber theft is even allows you to eliminate the problems of the human spy, the risky downloading and the audits of computer use, simple human error. So in corporate espionage alone, you all know this from reading the news just like I do, losses range in the billions. In 2011, the United States government, for the first time in a report by the NCIX, named the Chinese and the Russians as the main perpetrators, which I don't think surprised anybody. Aside from corporate information, Chinese clearly steal U.S. government information as well. There was a study done in 2007 that said that they estimated there were 10 to 20 terabytes of information, mostly from Department of Defense, that had been taken. I'm not a computer guy, so I didn't know what a terabyte was. I had to look it up, and I was kind of surprised to find out that amount was equivalent to about 10% of the holdings, entire holdings of the Library of Congress. I don't even know how they could read all that information, much less steal it, but anyway. The PRC, or China, clearly denies this, which is kind of easy to do because it's difficult to attribute these attacks and pinpoint the perpetrators. But in April of last year, there was a study done by a security company called Mandiant that revealed that a particular hacking threat against some 140 Western organizations was traceable to 4 large networks in Shanghai, where there are units of something called the 3PLA located. 3PLA being third section of the People's Liberation Army. It's roughly the Chinese equivalent of NSA. I'm just going to go one more thread, if you will, and I'll stop. And are there question and answers here, or? Well, there are questions. I don't know whether there'll be answers or not, but I'll try. Terrorism. I mean, certainly a major event in national security in this century was 9/11 and the war on terrorism. The idea of a bomb in a city is clearly more critical than spies skulking around in government safes. But counterespionage plays a role in counterterrorism as well. Because of the American spies in the Cold War, the Navy's nuclear submarine fleet was vulnerable. Our secret military communications were read. The NATO defense plans for Europe were in Soviet hands. Fortunately, since the Cold War never erupted into an armed conflict, the U.S. always had time to take countermeasures and recover from the damage from these espionage cases. Terrorist threats different, it's imminent. Might not have the same kind of time as you had in the Cold War. Fortunately, we have not had a problem with terrorist spies in the government, but there have been some. One case to me that was most disturbing was a gentleman named Ali Mohammed. He was an Egyptian emigre, married an American, came to the United States, became a citizen. He joined the Army. He was a sergeant. He was actually an instructor in Middle Eastern Studies at the JFK Warfare School for Green Berets in Fort Bragg. While he's in the Army, he's training terrorists in explosives, including some who were involved in the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. He was discharged in 1989, became close to Osama bin Laden, helped to orchestrate his move out of Sudan, trained Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, trained Somalis, was finally implicated in the bombings of the 2 U.S. embassies in Africa in '98, and eventually he's caught and sentenced to life in prison. But this is still an issue today because the National Counterterrorism Center, many experts on counterterrorism have noted that Al-Qaeda has increasingly become interested in recruiting Westerners, people who will arouse less suspicion, will be less suspect, and of course can fulfill their plots. And what better place to infiltrate a spy than in the United States government, especially in its intelligence or its law enforcement community. So on that happy note, I'll end, and I'll take any questions or brickbats or anything people would have. Randy.
Mike, you mentioned just very in passing.
Why don't you identify yourself?
Oh, sure, sorry. Randy Fort with Raytheon. You mentioned just in very quick passing Edward Snowden. And that he seems to be emblematic of a 21st century kind of counterintelligence, counterespionage challenge, which is both he and Bradley Manning taking, in his case, perhaps the largest volume of information in the history of American intelligence, at least 1 million documents, and not pages, but actual documents of multi-page. Not apparently because he was under the control of a foreign intelligence service or foreign government, but just out of some very bizarre, misplaced sense of outrage or political disagreement with the procedures that he happened to be party to. Manning similarly causing great damage. So this so-called insider threat versus the classic spy. So I just wonder, where do you see this going, and how should the government be responding to a nature of threat which doesn't exactly align with what we've seen in the past in terms of motivation.
Yeah, well, so, you know, a number of people, a number of us in the counterintelligence community for at least the last decade or more have been saying that the systems administrator would be, you know, the most frightening spy or the future, well, also the most frightening leaker, as it turned out as well. Just because as both of these cases you mentioned indicate, and look at the access they have and what they were able to steal. The other issue there too is, you know, if Edward Snowden had been caught spying for Iran and giving all these documents away, he'd probably get a less sympathetic ear in court. However, cases like Snowden or Manning, I think, are going to be harder and harder to try in the future. It's going to be very difficult for the FBI and Department of Justice, you know, these cases, because there's so much sympathy in the public for what they've done, which is not the case. You don't see much sympathy for spies, but leakers is a different story. So I think the whole field of hacktivism or the insider threat where it's leaking, and of course if there's problems in prosecuting these cases, that's only going to prompt more people to feel they can get away with it. There's the, you know, the deterrence factor is clearly abating. So that's why I got some, you know, former FBI here. I had the former head of counterintelligence for the United States government. So if you want to say something, I would welcome that as well. You don't have to, though. I mean, I'm not going to pay you, so you're on your own. Anyway.
Well, based on that, Mike, so I want to push on this question. I'm Michelle Van Cleve. And,
Michelle was a former head of the National Counterintelligence Executive, so you got a lot of experience in this room.
So, Mike, you point out that Hansen was the last American that was prosecuted, convicted of spying for the Russians. And
Well, I said major spy. Yeah, but there have been some others, but I consider them minor. Not, yeah.
And you also point out that the Russians have not let up from their Cold War tempo of their operations against the United States. So I put two and two together, and I'm not comforted by the notion that we haven't caught any of these spies since Hansen. But setting that aside, I want to push on Randy's point about Snowden and ask you to put on from drawing on your experience, and now just if you would speculate for us. Is Snowden a spy? And if so, how might he have been recruited and when?
Oh, there's all kind of stories I could write about that one.
So are you asking, Mike, is he a spy by his actions, or is he a spy because we are to intuit a state sponsorship not previously disclosed?
John, I'm asking you both.
Yeah, I mean, there is certainly a possibility that he could have been recruited by Chinese or more likely Russians beforehand. But the fact that he went to Hong Kong first, if he'd gone right to Moscow, I would have been more inclined to believe that the Russians were involved in this from the beginning. But I don't think the Russians would have ever let him go near anywhere in China if he was working for them from the start. But I mean, that's just guesswork.
And now?
And well, now, you know, when he said, well, I don't have any secrets, because whether he wittingly does it or unwittingly has given something away, you know, as soon as he plugs in that laptop, I'm sorry, baby, that's gone. Everything that's in there will be sucked out. But I mean, we all know how good the Russians are at computer technology. I mean, these are among the best mathematicians in the world, in addition to their prowess in ice dancing and everything else. But they are good mathematicians.
Well, definitionally, he's a spy. Title 18, U.S. Code 793 and 794, 3 elements of the crime. None of them require state sponsorship, right?
And it doesn't require passing something to a foreign power. It could just be the person's unauthorized. Is that correct?
It requires that it either does damage to the United States, it's a disjunctive. It does damage the United States, or it advantages a foreign entity. So it's very clear by both directions they were trying to do some damage to a U.S. position. both Manning and
Yeah,
Snowden.
and he has been charged under espionage statutes. Yeah.
Whether they're gonna be charged or not, that's a matter for the AG, and that there's a certain amount of public policy involved there. But definitionally, three elements of the crime, guilty of spy.
Yeah.
Whether or not they'll be charged as spies, different issue.
But
It has nothing to do
any,
with whether or not they were either originally directed or subsequently directed by a hostile, by any form of hostile or not. So that's
And in the
almost.
comment statute, you don't even have to show damage, right?
Pardon me?
For the comment statute, you don't even have to show damage.
So they come right.
but I think anybody who believes that that he had no information, or the Russians were not able to exploit any information that he had on the computers, are the same people who think that he wouldn't move into Crimea, which the last I checked, that he did. I mean, Putin
And an
did, yeah.
important point to make about when you mentioned Pollard, Mike, is they might have gotten it through a penetration of the Chinese in before he left Hong Kong. Right? I mean, the whole piece of, well, the Allies spy, but it doesn't hurt us, well, that presumes there aren't second order and third order relationships whereby it falls into the hands of somebody who do us damage by virtue of other relationships.
But, yeah.
So again, you don't want to get caught up in the foreign power sponsorship with regard to who he aspired. Of course he is.
But the problem is that he's, clearly a good deal of the American public does not see him as a spy,
And that's what I'm saying.
or even as a leaker. He's seen as a hero to many.
Right, and that becomes
So,
a political issue for the attorney.
If he's caught, that's going to be a tough case to try. I mean, no.
I'll serve on the jury.
Yeah, I think you might get bounced off. Man,
I think Snowden's actions are one aspect of the issue, which is spoken to the other, and that is the utter ineptitude of American officials to defend the defensible. And I think that we're going to remain vulnerable if we remain as naive and unsophisticated as a people. How do you begin to turn the American public away from this airy attitude about the world and defend people who are out there defending us?
yeah. I mean, I would like to see, I guess I'll be on Snowden's side. I'm advocating for transparency. I mean, I guess if I were the head of the NSA, I would have given every scare story, every frightening story that I could get across without compromising a particular collection method or a particular source, just so people would say, this is something that was prevented, this is what could have happened. This is how many, I mean, I think they try to do, they call it the subway bombing and everything, but somehow it just,
Well, I don't think the NSA is enough. It has to be a ring, a circle of government officials
Mhm.
who are part of the process and who depend on the information, who stand up for those secret gathering agencies.
but I think what you have to give examples that show this is what could have happened. This is what was prevented as a result of these particular programs that you're having problems with. Sure?
Jim Longley, I want to just pick up on the lady's comment and maybe rephrase the question, and you kind of teed this up. But NSA has acknowledged that they lost 1.7 million documents. Why or how is it so difficult for the IC to beg the question of how many documents do you actually need to release to show surveillance? Out of 1.7 million, was it a dozen maybe? And it just begs the question that this guy had to know a heck of a lot more about what he was doing than just unveiling a surveillance operation. I mean, and frankly, it's almost offensive that question hasn't been answered.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's what's interesting, he's looked at by many as a hero, but he has, in terms of whistleblowing even, he has not revealed a single case that I know of an American who has been unfairly targeted or who has lost his livelihood or whatever as a result of these programs. He just said the programs are bad. Well, Congress did pass it. In fact, they renewed it with all the attention they give to renaming a post office. The courts have supervision of it, and in the executive branch there are checks and balances as well. So, but the fact is, but also, I mean, that he lost a lot of his moral high ground when he starts operations about targeting Huawei or targeting the Russians at the G8 or G20, all these that are legitimate foreign intelligence collection operations. So what is it? None of that has anything to do with the United States citizens. So to me, he lost any moral high ground at that point, but as you're right, I mean, that is all kind of forgotten about. And the other thing, I'll get on my high horse on this, I don't think that Angela Merkel really cares one bit that they're listening to their telephone. You know what the objection is in Europe? Because most of our colleagues, their former colleagues in the intelligence services there, are not happy because this only has turned a light on what they do inside their countries, and they don't want that. And the problem with that is that erodes the trust of those people in us. And so no matter what ally it is, if they happen to get some piece of information about a terrorist plot, but it's dicey because it concerns one of their citizens, and they say, should we share this with the United States? It might be in the newspaper, we can't trust them. That's to me, one of the greatest damage, if you will, that has come out of it. I mean, there's a lot of damage that's come out of it, but to me, one of the greatest is it erodes the trust of our foreign partners, and we depend on them for counterterrorism. Never have we depended more on foreign intelligence services on a particular threat than we do on terrorism. Anyway, get off my podium now. So. Can I go? I'll just go to that gentleman back there. I'll get to you.
Hi, Jeff Capella. It seems like the comments center around the interaction between telecommunications technology, strategic information influence operations, and agents of influence. On the last part, I was wondering if you could maybe unpack what your thoughts are on, say, the impact of agents of influence regarding the counterintelligence agency's ability to prosecute their mission. I think of examples such as the statements given by General Lawless to Congress in 2007 regarding Chinese agents of influence towards certain members of our Congress. If you look at Operation Ghost Stories, which would just be classified by 2012 by FBI, maybe you could touch on that.
Okay.
Just the impact of agents of influence have by that act on behalf of U.S. adversaries regarding the counterintelligence community's ability to prosecute their mission.
I'm very skeptical of agents of influence, and I will say I know our neighbors to the north, the Canadians, have had a lot more problems with Chinese influence in their parliament, and it's pretty well proven. I mean, it's just outright. It's just that kind of influence, or buying things like that, clearly not good, but they're agents of influence or influencing policy. I'm a little skeptical of that. It's kind of hard to prove. I'll give you an example that I've written about in both of these books. I mentioned this man before named Harry Dexter White, senior person in Treasury. He was basically used also not only to provide intelligence, but as an agent of influence policy. The Soviets actually came to him with a list of points they wanted to present because they wanted to convince the Roosevelt administration that the Japanese were bad and they were going to attack, and so because they didn't want the Japanese on them. They had enough problems dealing with the Germans on the other front. The fact was, most of those the Soviet points were shared by a number of people in the Roosevelt administration already. So did this guy really have any influence? Later on, as the war ended, he then took more points from the Soviets about what to do with post-war Germany, and the Russians basically wanted to leave post-war Germany a shambles. That didn't fly as much as he tried to influence that. Other example, more up to date, is a woman arrested for she was parlor maid was arrested, right? Yeah.
And I was going to bring up that point.
Yeah. So the woman, her name was Katerina Leung. Code name was parlor maid. So she's arrested. She's a FBI source for years, providing them intelligence. Turns out she's actually working the other side of the street for the Chinese. But then there's a question of, was she an agent of influence? She influenced U.S. policy. I mean, the Chinese giving her things which she then passes to the U.S. government. Very hard to say. Lots of people, probably with similar thoughts who are not Chinese spies for the Chinese. It's very hard to pick that out. Another example is Ana Montes, spied for the Cubans. She authored a paper about, kind of soft on the Cubans. And, it actually made it through DIA, and it went to the Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, who said, it's too soft for me, rewrite this thing. I don't believe that. So it's hard to pinpoint how much influence a particular agent of influence actually has. And I've seen this from our side too. I mean, from working on the other side of the street when we're trying to influence a foreign government. It's just hard to say how much influence they really have. Now, ghost stories, that's the illegals, right? Yeah, well, they weren't, frankly, they didn't influence anybody. I mean, let's face it, they had no, how many American spies or sources were arrested as part of that? 0. Who were they influencing? I mean, the closest they even came to an agent was somebody was Hillary Clinton's stockbroker or something that one of them was in contact with. And another one met Al Gore's former national security advisor, Leon Furt, that he was trying to work him at Harvard. Until Furt said one day, he said, yeah, you sound like you have a slight Russian accent. That's a true story. And of course he got scared. He never saw Furt again. So they didn't really accomplish, either in terms of influence or in terms of collecting American secrets. They didn't really accomplish anything.
Would you apply that analysis to Elizabeth O'Baggy?
What do I do what now?
Would you apply that same position to Elizabeth O'Baggy? She was the one that sat there and said she had a PhD from Georgetown. Comes to find out she doesn't have a PhD. She actually was advocating for us to sit there and arm certain members of the National Opposition Coalition in Syria.
John Kerry cited her paper before Congress.
Right.
I don't.
As an argument to get a war in Syria.
Right.
John Kunstadter, Redzima Photo. A two-part question, please. First, in your experience, were there traits in people who you wanted to hire for counterintelligence, that personality traits that you found to be indicators that they would be good at their job? And the second part is, this is a question from the outside, but according to the press, the FBI has really limited the amount that it exposes its agents in training to what Islam is really all about. And how are we going to be able to go after, and I'm not just talking about terrorists, but for instance, the Gulen group from Turkey has infiltrated all through this country. How are we going to train our people to understand what they're up to if they don't have really gimlet-eyed training about various aspects of Islam?
Yeah, I knew there was some cutback in bureau training because of sensitivities about the manuals used, but I don't think
They revisited the curriculum, they didn't cut back. So when I came in '82,
it was a particular manual or something that people. Yeah.
But there was, when I came in, there were 2 hours on terrorism in a 16-week course. Now there's 4 weeks on terrorism in a 16-week course. Now there's 4 weeks of counterterrorism in a 20-week course. So they didn't cut back on the core agent training, and they added almost a full month of CT. And they've extended the probationary period a full year to incorporate. Everybody has to do a turn on CT also. So it might be misunderstood in the translation, but in fact they haven't cut back, they've added. But they have amended. They have amended because of the sensitivity issue 3 years ago.
Right, but I would like to focus my question not on counterterrorism training, but on understanding what the kind of global civilizational jihad, which doesn't necessarily mean throwing bombs, but it means subverting our system.
But I think that's my understanding that is part of it. It's not just terrorist groups, and this is a picture of a bomb. It is on the roots of it. Besides, I mean, that's my understanding. It certainly is at the CIA as well. It's interesting, because there are some who argue that there has been too much emphasis on counterterrorism and the Islamic Jihad, and to the detriment of issues like China, Russia, which clearly now is the last week or so was resurgent, Iran, and so on. I mean, there clearly was a big push of the FBI as well as the CIA after 9/11. I mean, people were shifted off, all kind of other, threats as well, be it North Korea or China. So, and even some who are arguing in Congress that we should right that balance now because nothing has happened since 9/11. Well, the reason nothing happened is because we focused our efforts on this to make sure nothing did.
If you mind me asking, I was just wondering if you could give us your personal sense of what we've lost with the recent passing of Lieutenant Bagley.
He was an outstanding officer of the agency. He, even as you know, late in life, still defended his thesis, which I don't agree with. But I think it's still necessary to have that conversation. You constantly have to just, if you haven't solved those mysteries, it's necessary to still talk about them to prevent future ones from happening. And he stuck with it, right till the end. I mean, he was in his 80s when he wrote Spy War. So.
It's more of like a larger organizational question. My name is Snowman. I'm an Army officer. The last 10 years, we've been pretty much working, kind of hand in glove with the agency and their agency process. That's sort of been a mantra, need to share, so the intel community passes on information, intelligence, so we can action it on the ground. That mantra has mainly been created because of the need for the CT flight, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now that fight is slowly diminishing, particularly now that we're completely out of Iraq, just about, and we're pulling out of Afghanistan, do you think the agency mantra that has been maintained the last 10 years will dissipate, and we're going to have the agency go back to what they did, human focus only, not necessarily supporting DoD as strong as they have? But it took a long time, but I saw just in my 10-year span, to pull out and get reporting from the agency and different organizations. Do you think it's going to maintain itself, or are we just going to go stovepipe back to
No, I think it'll maintain itself because, one of the keys to that is the fact there's joint training now. I mean, the military and the civilians, the CIA, and then the military train together. So they know each. I mean, I've seen cases where, there'd be some, one of these usual turf battles someplace, and it turns out a guy on one side, on the military side, actually attended training with a guy in the CIA side. They know each other. They get the thing solved overnight. So I think the fact you've got a whole new cadre of young people coming up who have grown up in this environment as opposed to the environment that I grew up in, which was don't share with anybody, especially the FBI. No, but really, I mean, we grew up in that stovepipe environment. Now, on the other issue, you did mention that the NTS issue, the need to share. And that's, I find that a separate issue in a sense. Because of this, the Americans have this, to me, have this tendency is if something goes wrong, we go all the way over the other side of the pendulum, We never find the middle ground. So, we didn't connect the dots and people weren't sharing. So now we're going to go through an orgy of sharing everything with everybody. Why does Bradley Manning, a PFC, need to have access to cables about North Korea when he's sitting in Iraq to do his job? I don't get that. But all that information is available. I would probably say that Snowden, again, I don't know how he actually got into what he got into, but the fact is he probably didn't need to have access to all those programs either. So this kind of, I think we went so far on the other side, we forgot compartmentation totally. If you get something about a terrorist threat, you have to share it with the right people. Does that mean that you have to give the name of the source in Al-Qaeda who gave you that? So that person then is neutralized or killed or whatever, and then you don't know about the next threat? To me, that's criminal. Anyway.
Earlier you used the word transparency.
I did? I'm sorry about that.
I think it actually slipped out. But no, seriously, I think you used it in the context of in a democracy, the need to be more public about what your activities are. But I'd be curious what your thoughts are about the word. And you also mentioned just a second ago the idea that you were brought up in a closed stovepiped environment. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about the balance between information that typically or traditionally we would want to classify, vice the abundance of information that's now appearing in open source. And not only that, but the whole issue of technology, which, as Manning and Snowden are demonstrating, the ease with which people can access information inside the system.
Yeah, and that's, you know, one of the problems now is not so much the sharing. I mean, I think, you know, everybody got over that hurdle as a result of 9/11. Well, then what happened is then people got inundated with information because there's so much available, whether it's open source, even whether it's classified. So how do you sift, how does the analyst, it's not a question that it wasn't shared or was kept withheld by DIA or CIA. It's just a glut of information. Where is the piece in there that I really need to prevent the threat? You know, I think one of the cases that I think strikes me is the Mutala, what's his name? The underwear bomber, Christmas Eve underwear bomb. There was so much information and noise out there and chatter, and this guy, and of course, you know, we didn't pick this guy up even though his father went to the embassy. There was so much information pouring in. That's the problem. You're going to miss something because of that. So I think the filtering aspect is one of the things people have to pay attention to. And again, not only because of what's available unclassified, but even in the classified systems now. Now, that doesn't mean I'm saying let's go back to the days where everybody just holds theirs tight to the vest. No, that's not what I mean. Sir?
Yes, sir. I was wondering how you would suggest we best counter some of the political action operations carried on inside the U.S. by Muslim Brotherhood fronts, such as the Council for American Islamic Relations. I'm particularly thinking of their attack against the FBI counterterrorism training program, as well as the counterterrorism training programs carried out by private organizations involved in training of thinkers.
Penetrate them. Sources inside. Best way to do it. That's my feeling. And the FBI is very good at that. Just let them do their work. Really, that's...
And Mike, that's not new. When he arrested, I forget his name now, but his son was a senior at Georgetown, and he had the application to the FBI. But the point of trying to penetrate the bureau of the agency via front door walk-ins and long-developed, you know, approaches of those kind they're not unique to terrorist groups or to state-sponsored penetrations of U.S. security apparatus.
I guess I silenced him with that one. So. Okay. Oh, right. One more.
This did get awkwardly dead silent there. I didn't want to originally get sucked into the Snowden thing, but one thing that really bothers me about the conversation about it, he just doesn't strike me. He looks like a man to me who's more leveraged and exploited. When you go back and look at the philosophical reasons he gave, saying that he was motivated by conscience, you just listen to it. It doesn't add up. Sounds like weakly concocted to me, and you know, then when you start adding in the other information, how did he have Tradecraft, how did he contact the wall, and all that stuff. But it seems too often that people just accept on his face that the motives that he gave us were correct.
Yeah, well, it gets back to Michelle's question. So I guess just to round it up with the first question asked on that is, I guess I look at the Russians also as so, you know, traditionalists who rarely stray. I mean, CIA had its own problems with that, but at least we'll innovate. We can get kicked into the 21st century, but the Russians are not like that. And if they had a source like Snowden, I just don't think they'd have him go public like that. Even though in the long run probably does more damage that way, but you know, when they get a source, they want to hold it in their own. But maybe they got everything they needed out of him and said, you know, if you postulate that he was working with them from the beginning, well, we got everything out of him, there's nothing more he can do. Although he was still working inside. I mean, presumably he could have done more. But they haven't really done that in their history. They get somebody they want to keep running him clandestinely rather than some... But, you know, again, maybe they've changed if he was working for them right from the start, but I don't know.
I don't feel strongly about it.
Yeah.
left me with more questions.
I'd like to believe he was working for them right from the start, because I just don't like the Russians. You live 5 years in that place, believe me, you don't like them.
Just a quick question. On all of these cases, I know that some of them passed polygraphs and were able to kind of get over some of the counter-espionage and counterintelligence techniques that we use. How do you think that we could maybe be better at some of these things? I know we rely on polygraph a lot, but that's kind of been busted by some.
I think we used to rely on the polygraph as this is the ultimate arbiter. That's less so as a result of these, those who slip through, if you will. I think it's less so these days. It's only considered one aspect in the whole, in the entire review of somebody, whether say it's an applicant or somebody undergoing reinvestigation. So, I did not ask me the follow-up question, like, how do they beat the polygraph? Because frankly, I don't know. And if you're brought up a Catholic, you can't beat it. Just forget it. That I can tell you right from the start. Right? We all know that, right? So.
I know it's a novel, but Charles McCrary's Lucky Bastard was seen to be plausible about a former U.S. president being recruited by the Soviets. Did you ever, in your career, ever worry that there were people right at the top who'd been turned?
No, I mean, I was too worried about the people in the bottom that were turned. But no, I didn't. No. I didn't. Charles McCrary, by the way, former CIA officer.
Michael, I wanted to ask you if you are free to give any reflections about the distinction between tactical counterintelligence and strategic counterintelligence. And very specifically, when one deals with a lot of these individual spies, each of whom may make a real strategic difference, as you've pointed out, Walker and so on and so forth, to what extent is there thinking in the U.S. government about trying to do, in a way, strategic offensive counterintelligence operations that are designed to really distort the entire way an enemy intelligence service is thinking about multiple targets within the United States and its overall purposes? I mean, it may sound like a very grand project, but I suppose this really gets into the realm, when the Soviets tried to work this type of thing on us, I believed it was done in the form of strategic deception, where the idea was to try to get the United States, the academic world, Sovietologists, and the U.S. government to believe that the Soviet genetic code was other than what it really was, so that there would be a false conventional wisdom about their strategic intentions, for example. I mean, that is the kind of a deception is the sort of thing that a tyrannical government can do against us. I'm wondering to what extent people are thinking in those terms when it comes to dealing with major foreign intelligence threats like the Chinese today. Maybe you can't talk about this.
Well, I don't think we've really given it. I can see this is right up your alley, Michelle. Would I be right? No. I mean, but I think I don't think. Yeah, I don't think that we've really. I bet you. I know you would agree with me that we haven't really focused on this. You know, it is considered, I think, so, in a sense, too complex to pull off. You know, that we probably do mostly tactical counterintelligence, I would say. And it is hard to pull off. But the Soviets are, they're much better at it than we are. But even when they did it, they had, a kind of concentrated enemy. And the one I'm thinking about, of course, is the most famous deception operation, I think, in history is the Trust. But again, they were dealing with a certain target population, which made it easier for them to manipulate. But they did And it is a classic job. I mean, that's strategic deception at its best. But I don't think that we, yeah, we don't. I don't think that we think in those terms. You know, there's a tendency to let's just stop the spy of today, and deceptions are too hard. There have been some that have worked. I can't talk about them, but nothing on the scale that you're talking about. You should say something here. You don't have to, but.
I think you addressed that very well, and I was more interested in what you would say. Sounds good. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it sounds good, but I mean, I think this sounds correct, probably.
The
Yeah,
notion that we don't do that,
Yeah.
or haven't been able to do that very successfully as a strategic counterintelligence tool of statecraft is still something to which I think this nation should aspire, given the level of threat. I think you agree with that.
And another aspect of this too is if you look at it, there are about, and Michelle knows this better than anybody, there must be about 16 different definitions of counterintelligence and counterespionage in the U.S. government. Every agency looks at it differently. And I think that also inhibits the ability to do that.
Mike, I would say during the Cold War, the effort to influence the Soviet Union via a very carefully modulated technology transfer program that we prohibited certain things from getting to them and had a massive effort to deny them technology, but we also had a very sophisticated effort to make sure they got their hands on certain technologies, which we wanted them to have and put into their system so that we could take advantage of that under certain circumstances. Some of that story has come out, not all of it, because it was extraordinarily successful. So in that circumstance, I don't know if you'd call that CI exactly, John, but there was at least some evidence of some very devious and sophisticated thinking that we used against the SOs.
Yeah, but it's usually, again, small, targeted, very specifically focused programs rather than a grand design.